Hello, everybody. This is a screencast lecture for the United States involvement in the First World War, otherwise known as the Great War. The focus of this section is to look at the United States domestic issues as well as our short involvement in the war over the 9 months approximately that we were engaged in World War I and then the aftermath of the First World War. One of the things I wanted to point out to you is that, of course, in the First World War, one of the major changes that took place was the increased level of technology in this war. It certainly became a war of the modern age, of the Industrial Revolution in the 20th century, as we saw the implementation of numerous new weapons that changed the conduct of the war as well as increased the number of casualties. The largest number of combat casualties were caused by long-range heavy artillery. Some artillery large enough, for example, like the Paris gun, which was created by the Germans specifically to launch artillery attacks into the French capital of Paris, had a range similar to being able to attack the city of Lawrence from the city of Topeka. But certainly machine guns played a major role in the course of the war. The air combat, of course, began in the First World War. Balloons had been introduced in earlier wars, but in the First World War, it's the first time that we see aircraft being used, fighter planes, and then later bombers that were built specifically to attack long-range targets, and then, of course, the use of airships known as Zeppelins that would have been used to launch attacks across the English Channel into Great Britain. But also, of course, the use of mustard gases, chlorine gases. I believe there were close to 50 or 60 different types of poisonous gases that were used in the war. The introduction of the tank, and all this new technology certainly changed the way war was used tremendously, from being a kind of a personal type of combat to a more a distant type of combat where people felt that they were often just targets, had no control over what would take place, and of course led to massive casualties. Life during the war, of course, much of the war was very difficult for the combating troops. Of course, trench warfare was used extensively, and as a result, there were many medical problems associated with that. Life in the trenches, such as trench foot and trench mouth, the decay of feet, the decay of gums from constant exposure to mud and water. Shell shock, of course, the new term that comes out of the war, which had many of the components that we would often think of post-traumatic stress disorder today. But for the main focus of this lecture is really about the United States involvement in the war. And the United States had a tremendous impact once we did declare war on the Central Powers, with more than 3 million American men being drafted into the U.S. military. And I think during the course of the war, about 1.5 million men ended up serving in Europe. Certainly the size of the American military forces were able to turn the tide of the war in the favor of the Allied powers. And the war spent or had a big impact on changing things at home in the United States, a lot of domestic changes. For example, the U.S. government created the War Industries Board, which organized how much materials were being used for the war effort, the organization of production quotas, as well as setting prices for products, and also setting wages in many war-related industries. The U.S. government also rationed many items during the course of the war to make sure that items were available for our military. we went to providing large amounts of food for our own military, as well as continuing to provide support for the other allied powers. So the US government went to campaign to encourage people to consume less. So, for example, they had special days of the week set aside when people would be encouraged to not consume food related products, such as having wheatless Wednesdays. And then, of course, people were encouraged to produce their own food. So we saw the implementation of creating victory gardens where people would grow their own produce. The war itself was financed specifically through raising taxes and through the implementation of a war bond effort where a person would invest in the war itself, pay a price up front for a wartime investment known as a bond, and then that bond could be cashed in later for its face value as well as the interest on it. And this was a very popular way that people could show their patriotic support of the war. There was a tremendous amount of wartime propaganda put in place to encourage American citizens to support the war. And it went to the negative side in some cases because there were many anti-immigrant feelings that were created as propaganda convinced people that to be outside of the United States was to be an enemy, possibly of the United States. And that was a trend that kind of continued on even after the war, where the United States in the 1920s is going to dramatically cut immigration to the U.S. And as part of the propaganda movement, it also had some negative impact on the way people viewed aspects of free speech. The U.S. government passed two different laws. One was the Espionage Act, which was trying to target spying against the United States, but then also the Sedition Act, which sedition is using your words and actions as an attempt to overthrow or hurt a government. And the U.S. government under President Wilson made it illegal to criticize the president and to criticize the American involvement in the war. And as a result, there were about 1,500 people that were put in jail during the course of World War I, which, of course, we see now as a very severe attack on free speech. And it was recognized, of course, for that at the time, but so much of the patriotic fervor caused people to believe that it was necessary to restrict free speech. It ended up being quite a tragedy connected to the war. In addition, there was a lot of economic changes that took place. One of the major social changes and economic changes took place because of many war-related jobs coming available in northern cities. There was a lack of labor as many people, men especially, went into military service, and thousands and thousands of African Americans were recruited from the southern states and encouraged to move to the north to take some of these jobs in American industry, and it had a tremendous social impact on the United States. Wages were far higher than anything a person could earn in the South, and as a result, it was a major economic boom to African Americans as well. And in fact, the wages during the war in general just went up for everybody. There's examples of people, prior to the war making $6, $10 a week. And then during the course of the war, their wages were increased to $100, $110 a week. So a dramatic impact on people's lives economically. Major advances for women, large variety of jobs opened up, and then of course, as a result of the war itself, finally women were able to gain the right to vote, and it was presented as a war-related measure that women were so important to the conduct of the war because of their work in industry that they deserved the right to vote. And so women gained the right to vote in 1920 after the passage of the 19th Amendment. In addition, kind of a secondary idea is that the war also, at the end, saw tremendous impact as a result of the flu epidemic that swept around the globe at the very tail end of World War I. In the United States, about 600,000 people died of the Spanish flu, And the pandemic worldwide, I believe, was somewhere close to about 20 million people. So it was really a devastating time period in world history and had tremendous impact because of that reason. Um, the American involvement in the war directly militarily was pretty short lived because we were only in the war for about a 9 month period. And the only major offensive that the United States was involved in was known as the Meuse Argonne Offensive. It's the last big attack against the Central Powers, and it led to the defeat of the Central Powers. It was led by American General John J. Pershing, nicknamed Blackjack Pershing, and the American forces in the First World War that served in Europe were known as the American Expeditionary Force. Tremendous American losses in the short time we were involved. More than 100,000 Americans died, many of those related to illness, disease, exposure, but certainly a tremendous number of deaths. So the U.S. didn't suffer as much as many countries, but certainly our suffering was very severe and by far worse than any other conflict the U.S. had been involved in, of course, other than the Civil War, where we were, of course, fighting against ourselves. The war comes to a close in 1917. We talked in our simulation about how the Russian Revolution was on the verge of taking place, and the Russians did experience the Communist Revolution during the war, and they dropped out of World War I, signed their own peace treaty with the Germans. German military forces began to revolt in November of 1918. There was a big revolt that took place on several German naval bases. Eventually, the revolt spread into the capital city of Berlin, and the ruler of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, was forced to abdicate or give up his throne. And finally, the end of the fighting came to a close in November of 1918, November 11th, on what is known today as Armistice Day, the 11th month, the 11th day of the 11th month at 11 a.m., so 11/11/11, which of course is celebrated as Veterans Day today, but was Armistice Day well up through the 1950s, 60s, and I believe became Veterans Day in the early 1970s during the Nixon administration. The cost of the war is severe. You can see the numbers, the total numbers of deaths, tremendously devastating for so many countries, and very difficult to recover from. It's often referred to as the loss of a generation. You can see the numbers of refugees, and then, of course, the tremendous economic cost of the war is estimated about $350 billion, and then you multiply that for what it would have been for inflation, and you multiply it by about 15 to 18 to get the economic cost today. So tremendously expensive. The United States' main interest in the war began because, of course, the United States plans to really protect neutral rights as well as protect the aspects of democratic governments worldwide. And this last component of this lecture is the end of the war and the Versailles Treaty. President Wilson had spoke often of his plans to try to make this a war to end all wars. And what he came up with was a plan that is known historically as the 14 points. And it basically was a peace plan created to try to eliminate the causes of war. There are obviously 14 different kind of bolded point aspects of the war. And the 14th point, the last point, is one of Wilson's kind of favorite components, which was the creation of the League of Nations, which is somewhat of a predecessor of the United Nations today, but it was the idea of a world governing body that would help prevent future wars from taking place by giving a ability for countries to be able to work out their problems almost through like a court system and through a negotiation system. Wilson was the first American president to travel during his presidency to Europe, and he had high hopes for what would take place, but of course, when he arrives in Europe, he's kind of brought back to reality. The main reason why he's brought back to reality is that when he met with the other leaders of the main allied nations, which are referred to as the Big Four, and that includes David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, George Clemenceau, the President of France, and Vittorio Orlando, who was the leader of Italy. And part of the problem that Wilson experienced is that these nations had been so devastated by the war, and they put a lot of blame on the Germans and the Central Powers in general, that they wanted to punish the Central Powers. And for example, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, he had been reelected to his Prime Minister position with running on the slogan of "Make Germany Pay." So there's a real strong essence of kind of revenge in place. So when the Treaty of Versailles was passed, it made a lot of different changes in Europe. Some of the changes that President Wilson was interested in and hoped to achieve, but the other ones were really put in place as kind of a punishment to the Central Powers, and particularly towards Germany. 9 new nations were established with land that they took from the countries that were defeated, but they also took it from Russia, one of the main allied nations, because they were kind of punishing them, I think, for dropping out of the war and the fact that they had come under communist control. They took all military power away from the Germans as much as possible. They shrunk their army. They eliminated their air power. They reduced their navy, and made it so that the Germans, in the Allies' minds, hopefully could never cause a war again. And then Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war in a section that's known as the War Guilt Clause, which is probably not very fair because of the fact that many of the nations were really pushing militarism and had been kind of antagonistic prior to the war. One of the big components is that it required Germany to pay war reparations, damages for the war that originally the amount was set at like $62 billion or so, and then it was reduced later to about $33 billion. But either way, it was tremendously expensive and was nearly impossible for the Germans to make payments on. Although Germany did continue to make those payments until Adolf Hitler became the leader of Germany in the late 1920s. This is the way Europe looked prior to the Versailles Treaty in terms of the political boundaries. This is the way Europe would have looked at the start of World War I. And then as you can see here, and I'll show you a comparison map, look at the national boundary changes that took place. You can see the new countries that were created. The new countries of Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary were divided out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You can see how Austria-Hungary lost tremendous amounts of land. Poland became a new nation. The new nation of Yugoslavia was created, and many nations saw reduced boundary changes, including the Russians, who lost Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and as well as, you can't see it up here, but also the nation of Finland was taken from Russian territory, and that nation gained independence also. So tremendous changes that's going to cause a lot of antagonism. So make sure that you know these new nations that emerged. If you look on your review sheets for this unit test in the review packet, you will see the nations that you need to know for this exam. A lot of problems with the treaty. You can see some of the weaknesses that are here. There's definitely an aspect of humiliations that Germany felt very angry about. The new government in Russia felt like they had been severely mistreated because they had fought on the Allied side for so long, and they lost more territory than any of the other nations on the opposing side from the Allies, which seems particularly unfair in their mind for sure. And it created a lot of political instability by stripping Germany of all its territories. Germany also lost all of its colonial possessions as well around the world. And really, some of the big winners in the treaty would have been Great Britain and France, and even Italy was pretty much bent out of shape because they felt that they had not been rewarded for serving on the Allied side because they didn't receive any land as the other Allied nations had. So Wilson comes back home to the United States. A president can negotiate a treaty, but it has to be approved by the Senate, and it has to be passed by a two-thirds vote of the Senate. When he presents it to the Senate, remember that Wilson was a president from the Democratic Party, and the Senate at the time was dominated by Republicans. Many Republicans were very upset with the treaty. They felt like it wasn't really going to solve any of the problems that had led to the war, and they particularly opposed the new League of Nations, which is one of the reasons why Wilson supported the treaty, because he felt like the League of Nations could be the answer to a lot of the world's problems by helping to negotiate conflicts between countries. So the U.S. Senate never ratified the treaty. The U.S. would eventually sign its own treaty with Germany a couple of years later. And what's kind of sad about the end of all this is that Wilson really was trying to push the ratification. He traveled tirelessly around the country to try to get support from the treaty. And it ended up that he had a stroke and was incapacitated for the whole last portion of his presidency. He spent it in bed and was never really able to be a force when the vote was taken within the Senate. And so the war ends for the United States with kind of an anticlimactic type of feeling, because the feeling was that maybe, at least in Wilson's mind, was that this treaty could have tremendous impact. And it ended up that the U.S. never even signed it. We signed our own peace agreement with the other Central Powers at a later time. So without the United States support, and especially without the U.S. support for the League of Nations, which we never joined, it ended up being a very ineffective treaty, and it ended up being a really major economic problem for the Germans because of the reparations payments. So the legacy of World War II, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment. In the 1920s, the European economy never really fully recovered. There was tremendous economic problems connected to the costs of the war. Germany suffered tremendously, and it was a lot of these economic conditions that led to the problems in Germany that would lead to a number of radical political groups. And for example, the Nazi Party became popular within Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, who had served as a soldier in World War I, and he organizes a lot of the people that joined the Nazi Party into a feeling that he could solve the economic problems that Germany was facing, and the kind of the feeling of resentment that they had towards the Allies was part of the reason why the Second World War began, and that why Hitler got so much support. So in America, we began to kind of seclude ourselves again. We moved back to the policy of isolationism. In the 1920s, the first Republican president of the 20s, who is known as named Warren G. Harding, he adopts this policy of kind of returning back to normal, where we would avoid the conflicts of Europe and try to avoid another war. And so the 1920s becomes more of an American kind of decade again, where we ignore the outside world to some extent and take a very anti-war kind of approach. As a result, a number of problems start to develop, including the United States detachment from world issues that would keep us kind of away from being able to stop the problems that would later lead to World War II.